Hello everyone, my name is Aoife Larkin. I'm the Learning Manager for the Portico Library in Manchester, and it's my pleasure to introduce this event, Writing Anne Lister and LGBTQ plus History. First, a couple of words about the library. The Portico is a 19th century independent research library. Information about different forms of access and membership are available on request, but you can also just pay us a visit during opening hours to visit and view the amazing Georgian interior. We hold exhibitions and events throughout the year, which always respond to our collections. And in this event, we're so happy to help showcase the life of an amazing 19th century Northern woman. We are sorry this event couldn't be held in the library, but delighted that we could still bring you the opportunity to hear our speaker. We're planning other activities and events online, which you can find on our website, www.theportico.org.uk. It only remains to introduce Jill Liddington, who shares insights into her groundbreaking research on Anne Lister, which went on to inspire the wonderfully successful TV series Gentleman Jack. Jill is a longtime friend and supporter of the Portico, and her work on women's rights and the fight for the vote has made an invaluable contribution to history. I'm delighted to welcome Jill, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thanks very much, Aoife, and I'm delighted to come and speak at the Portico. So thanks to the Portico, thanks to Aoife, and thanks to Rachel, who's the behind the scenes whiz making the slides happen. Because of coronavirus, of course, we're having to talk on Zoom, which is always funny, isn't it? But we'll do it. I don't know where you are. Are you in Manchester? Are you in Yorkshire, where I am? Are you in the UK, US, Europe? Wherever you are, welcome. And tonight, as Aoife said, our trigger is Gentleman Jack. Did you watch the drama series last year? Well, if you did, you'll probably know that Sally Wainwright is a genius scriptwriter. But tonight, our focus isn't the TV drama. Rather, it's how generations of authors and editors have written about Anne Lister and her diaries over nearly 2 centuries since her death in 1840. And we're going to be looking at how they wrote through the lens of LGBTQ history. And our question is, how do you write about a woman who's already written 4, or it could be 5 million word diary and lived a lesbian life? Perhaps you've already read a little bit about Anne Lister. If not, don't worry. Let's start with a quick introduction to Anne Lister and then a couple of short readings from her amazing writings. So you've seen Gentleman Jack. So who was Anne Lister? And here we have some suggestions, some headlines. She was a scholar, a linguist. You know the language, she'd be prepared to learn it. She was a scientist. When young Charles Darwin was about to set sail, she was up there with geological reading. She was a landowner. She inherited Shibden Hall in 1826 from her uncle James. She was a businesswoman, unusual for women at the time, developing her own coal mines, a traveller. She went out to the Pyrenees, climbed Vic Merle, 1838, and the following year went to Russia, where she died the year after. A diarist, as we know, 1/6 of which is written in her own private code. She lived a lesbian life and recorded it all in candid detail, and has since inspired books and films. So let's locate ourselves. Have you actually visited Shibden Hall? It's near Halifax in the West Riding of Yorkshire. And here it is, John Horner's wonderful drawing from roughly the right year we want, 1835. It helps us imagine Shibden not as we see it today when we visit, but an ancient farmhouse. And it's a slightly pastoralized view. You'd never guess that Shibden was just outside rapidly industrializing Halifax. We can't see any smoking chimneys. Rather, it's the ancient acres that Anne Lister inherited from her uncle James on his death in 1826. It's a museum now, as you probably know, and sadly it's just closed, just the last few days, to prepare for filming for Gentleman Jack Series 2. But you can't, even if you can't visit Anne Lister's home right now, you should be able to later on, and I would encourage you to do so. It's wonderful. So where is Halifax? Here we've got Meyer's map, it's slightly adapted. You can see Halifax on the left, Shibden Hall slightly further up to the right. The road to Manchester, really important. down to on the left, and then going to the right beyond, further east from Shibden Hall past Hipperholm, you can see Lightcliffe and the Crownest estate, which we'll come to shortly. But we can't start our historical journey without a quick look at Anne Lister's many-worded diaries. They're incredible to decipher, they're incredible to transcribe, they're almost illegible, and 1/6 of it is in code. Are you ready? So here is a page of Anne Lister's diary from 1832, and you can see she's a highly organised diarist, and I'm peering in to get a slightly better picture of it. You can see at the top right, there's the date, 1832, the page number in the middle of each page, the date, May, and then the day and the date of the month all the way down. And we're going to be looking at Monday, the 7th of May, 1832. Anne Lister's just returning to Halifax. And let's see if we can have a read. So she's going from, this is from the red dot, she's a few lines in, few words in, King Cross Turnpike, and she's then going up Newbank up to Shibden, which is that third line in. And she arrives at 8:25. She has a funny way of doing the time. Found all well and as usual. Dinner at 9. My aunt came and sat with me, just wished my father and Marianne good night, came to my room at 10, siding, that is, putting away and tidying her things for half an hour. Fine day, 63 degrees Fahrenheit in my room, my blue room, now at 10:30, and then it goes on to the next day. So Anne Lister returns home in May 1832, and could it possibly be a quieter homecoming? Back to shabby Shibden is how she felt about it, and back to the Lister family. Her old soldier, elderly father shuffling about, her incredibly irritating younger sister Marianne, and it was really only her Aunt Anne that Anne Lister herself felt real affection to. For she's got money problems, she's very restless, but she soon decides she must reinvent herself, no longer just the high society flirt and European traveller of the 1820s, but now she's Anne Lister, inheritor of Shibden Hall's ancient acres. And so she's become a member of the landed gentry, Yorkshire landed gentry, albeit minor landed gentry. She's got power, a bit, authority, some. So what does she need? She needs a wife, of course. And have you read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice? I expect you have, and you may just remember, published 1813, and you might just remember the first line because it's pretty memorable. And I'm going to adapt Jane Austen, if I may, to Anne Lister. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single woman in need of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. A single woman in need of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. Indeed, as you know from reading about Anne Lister or from Gentleman Jack, Anne Lister soon meets neighbouring heiress Anne Walker of Crownest, and here is Crownest. And you can immediately see it's a more modern house, it's an 18th century house, and it's got more money to be spent on it. You can see the hot houses, and if you look to the left, there's a sort of folly covered in ivy where a hermit might sit. It's all the accoutrements of a well-to-do family. Anne Walker is younger than Anne Lister by about 12 years. She's wealthier, but it is a tricky one, this, new money, it's mercantile money. And Anne Walker is also rather isolated. But as you know from watching Gentleman Jack or your reading, Anne Lister sets around wooing Anne Walker in the moss hut, and that moves to seduction. And eventually, 2 years later, February 1834, there is a kind of betrothal, a kind of ceremony of exchanging rings, and then a marriage ceremony, our union, as Anne Lister calls it, to be sanctified at church with a sacrament, with communion. So let's have a look at the page. Here we have it. And we're looking by the red dot. So it's Sunday, Easter Sunday as it happens, March 1834. and we'll start at the very, very beginning. And it starts in code, which I don't think anybody's going to be able to read because it is so, so difficult. But it says, and I'm peering at the screen, 3 kisses, better to her than to me. They're obviously in bed. And then she measures the temperature, then down towards the second line. At Goodramgate Church, that's, if you know York, it's a little ancient church very near the much larger and grander Minster. At Goodramgate Church at 10:35, Miss W, Miss Walker, and I and Thomas. Thomas is the servant because, of course, in the 19th century, 2 elite women going to church would not be expected to carry their own prayer books and Bibles. You would have a servant walking behind to do that job for them. Miss Walker and I and Thomas stayed for the sacrament, that is for communion. And then she goes back into code towards the end of the 3rd line, if you can see. And she says, the first time I ever joined Miss Walker in my prayers, I had prayed that our union might be happy. She had not thought of doing as much for me. I had prayed that our union might be happy. She had not thought of doing as much for me. And I find the brevity of those few little coded words really quite sobering. And as you may remember, Gentleman Jack ends on that note with the 2 women coming out of Goodramgate Church. And by September, by the autumn, Anne Walker has moved into Shibden Hall, and here we can see it again. She moves in to live with Anne Lister at Shibden Hall. She's agreed to do that. And do we have a picture of domestic harmony? Well, pretty much. Yeah, there's a lot of enjoyment together in bed, social visits, reading of an evening, traveling, will reading of an evening, because of course they have to read their wills because they both own estates. They're not very likely to have immediate direct descendants. So will reading, and indeed will reading is the language of love at Shibden of an evening, and then will redrafting. Plus travel, 1838 they go to the Pyrenees, 1839 they set off together for Russia, and as you know, in 1840 Anne Lister dies. So here's just a brief taste of the diary writing. And I want to take a bit of a pause now and change direction to look broadly at how different editors and authors have selected and written on Anne Lister, and to place them in their LGBT historical context, without which I think it's very difficult to understand, to grasp Anne Lister and what she was accomplishing. The diaries, as you know, end in 1840 with Anne Lister's death in Western Georgia, way beyond Russia. And Anne Walker very bravely arranges for the coffin to be transported back for burial at Halifax Minster. And Anne Walker herself moves back into Shibden. She's already a very troubled woman. And this moves us to our first timeline, Anne Lister timeline, which takes us from 1840 up to 1892. There we are. So after Anne Walker's death in 1854, John Lister's family moves into Shibden. He's of course an indirect, very indirect descendant of Anne Lister. And Anne Lister's melodramatic life stimulates, of course, local stories. Of course they do, such an amazing woman. The first writer that I know of, that I've come across to write about Anne Lister, is Rosa Kettle in 1872. It's a novel called The Mistress of Langdale Hall, and I'm just going to quote one little line from it, which will give you, I think, a taste of how it is based on and inspired by Anne Lister. She never intended to marry. No man would ever lord it over her in Langdale. She never intended to marry. No man would ever lord it over in her Langdale. Well, indeed, quite so. But of course, in mid-Victorian England, which it is by now, there's no hint of Anne Lister as a lesbian. That word did not exist. I'm not a LGBT historian and I'm not up on queer theory, so bear with me on that. But I'd like to view Anne Lister's life and writing through the LGBT history lens, if I may, which takes us to our next writer in the 1880s, which is young John Lister. He'd come to Shibden as a boy. He'd had a very elite academic education, and he's now back at Shibden, very scholarly, and he publishes in the local paper, the Halifax Guardian, for 5 years, a weekly series of extracts of Anne Lister's diary for 5 years, social and political life in Halifax. And where's he going to open it? Where will he start? Well, he starts in the 1837 general election, and Anne Lister and Anne Walker, as estate owners, doorstep their tenants to coerce them, sometimes almost quite sort of brutally, to vote in the blue interest, that is to vote in the Tory interest. But I know what you're saying. What you're saying is to yourselves, but women can't vote, how could they? Well, it didn't matter that women couldn't vote in the case of the two Annes, because there was no secret ballot yet, so they would know how their tenant voted, and there could be repercussions if they voted yellow. That's Whig or Radical. 5 years on, we move to about 1892. And here we can actually see John Lister. He's now a much older man, looking, please agree with me, very despondent. And Arthur Burrell, who taught at the Bradford Grammar School for Boys, not far away, a fellow antiquarian. And together, these two men cracked the code. And I'm now going to quote from a letter that Arthur Burrell wrote decades later after John Lister's death in the 1930s. And it's the most quoted, re-quoted paragraph I've ever written. And it's in Presenting the Past. Burrell wrote, way much later, up to that time, we knew nothing of the cipher alphabet. I distinctly remember taking a volume of the diaries, which he borrowed back to Shibden, and telling Mr. Lister I was certain of two letters, H and E. We then examined one of the boxes behind the panels at Shibden Hall, and halfway down the collection of deeds, we found on a scrap of paper these words, "In God is my..." We at once saw that the word must be hope, and that the H and the E corresponded with my guess. The word hope was in cipher, that is secret code. With these 4 letters, almost certain, we began very late at night to find the remaining clues. We finished at 2 a.m. These two men at Shibden. The part written in code turned out, after examination, to be entirely unpublishable. Mr. Lister was distressed, but he refused to take my advice, which was he should burn all the 26 volumes of the diaries. He was, as we know, an antiquarian, and my suggestion seemed sacrilege, which perhaps it was. And then Burrell goes on to say, the coded passages presented, and I quote, an intimate account of homosexual practices among Miss Lister and her many friends. And then Burrell added, this very unsavoury document contained evidence these friendships were criminal. So why was it so shocking? Why was it criminal? I think we've got to go back and look at LGBT history. And the context is, and here we're back to the timeline, we're back to 1885, so just a little bit earlier, the Criminal Law Amendment Act. And as you may know, this was an act, a pretty heavy act that made all male homosexual acts totally illegal. They'd been illegal before, and the criminal law was now tightened up. And it was not for nothing that it was known as the Blackmailers' Charter. Gay men could be blackmailed, and you all know about the Oscar Wilde trials of 1895. Yet, if this didn't actually affect women, if the law didn't touch women, lesbians, why worry? Because, I would suggest, sex between women was silenced as something abnormal, unspeakable. Lesbianism in this cultural context became something to be ashamed of, to be hidden. And I think that's where LGBT history can be illuminating. So around 1892, the diaries are put back behind the panels. And I think it helps to explain why John Lister, more than Burrell, is looking very, very despondent, because it seems that without doubt he himself was homosexual. And certainly a 40-year silence followed after putting the diaries back till his death in 1833. So could it get any worse? Could it get any worse for people wanting to work on the Anne Lister Diaries? Well, yes, because in 1918, as you know, in the UK, most women over 30 won the vote. And here we are coming up to 1929, 1921, 3 years later after that enfranchisement. 1929, a little known attempt in Parliament to extend the Criminal Law Amendment Act to women, to criminalise sex between women as gross indecency, and to smear post-suffrage feminist campaigners as, well, being guilty of promulgating lesbianism. And the MPs asked, apparently, they asked, will anyone's marriage be safe? But this attempt to legislate and criminalise women, lesbians, fell, because you cannot make something criminal like theft or burglary or murder without naming it. And what the MPs and the members of the House of Lords decided was that knowledge was dangerous, knowledge was fatal. And so this attempt to criminalise lesbianism fell. But the effect was cultural silencing again continued. And you know about 7 years later, 1928, the banning of Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness prosecution. So this takes us on to 1933 and the death of John Lister, the last of the Listers, of a long line of Listers to live at Shibden Hall. He dies. And Shibden Hall now fell to the Halifax borough. It was taken over by the local authority, Halifax borough. And so the task of sorting out the papers, and the Anne Lister papers were voluminous. It wasn't just the diaries, it was the letters and counts and travel and everything. And John Lister produced quite a lot of paper as well. So there was an awful lot of paper bulging out of trunks. The task of sorting out all these papers falls to the daughter of the Halifax librarian. And he was named Edward Green. So young Muriel Green, his daughter, also training to be a librarian, goes into Shibden Hall. The only other person there is a live-in constable, living in, I think, some gloom, just to check there was no thieving. Masses of manuscripts there. And Muriel Green begins working through them, particularly working on the letters. A few years pass, 3 years, and then 1936-37, Arthur Burrell, who by then is quite an elderly man, probably about to die fairly soon, sends a key to the code of Anne Lister's diary, the secret code, to her father, to Edward Green. And he instructs or encourages Edward Green, the librarian, to keep it under lock and key. And so this further confirmed Muriel Green in her decision to focus not on the diaries, but on the Anne Lister letters, on the letters, of which there are so very many, that Anne Lister wrote. And it presents very much the respectable face of Anne Lister. And in 1938, Muriel Green's dissertation was produced as a copy in the library. Because local lesbianism spelt local scandal, and often for the elite Halifax families whose surnames still meant something. This cultural silencing and self-censorship continued on into the 1950s, 1960s. And then another member of the Halifax cultural elite, Phyllis Ramsden, began working on travel essays. And such was the way of things then, just after the war. She herself, because she's connected to the well-known people in Halifax, she's given access to the key to the code. So she's able, with a lot of hard working and working with a friend of hers, Vivian Ingham, summarize the coded sections of the diaries. And these, if anybody's working on the code, on the diaries, very, very useful summaries. In Halifax, and indeed nationally, the censorship of homosexuality, male homosexuality, lasted right up till 1967, when, as you probably know, the Sexual Offences Act, it referred to homosexual acts, but it was just decriminalising male homosexual acts. But as we know, women are still affected, and a history of silencing had the effect of, for Muriel Green and now for Phyllis Ramsden, on limiting what they could do, certainly what they could do in the public realm. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, and it was just never ever mentioned. And then jumping forward a few decades, in 1980, I came to Halifax. I found it after living in Manchester and London and so on, a very traditional conservative with a small c, very small c town. Feminism hadn't arrived, in contrast to Manchester, but a few of us, Libby and me and others, we soon put pay to that. And it definitely wasn't a place where it was good to be gay in. It really, really wasn't, even though the Sexual Offences Act had been passed 13 years earlier. And then that takes us to 1984. And a Guardian article was published 17th of February 1984 and headlined the 2 million word enigma. It was based very largely on interviews with the elderly Phyllis Ramsden and the journalist, say David Ward, slightly cautiously, we might say now, concludes, and Anne Lister may have been a lesbian. I read this with real interest. And what I didn't realise at the time, but I now do, is that Phyllis Ramsden died the following year, 1985. And we can't know exactly what happened around the time of her death, but either she herself, before she died, destroyed her transcripts of the coded sections, the deciphering and transcribing of the coded sections, or she instructed her immediate descendants to burn them. Whichever way it was, those manuscripts, the transcripts of the coded sections don't exist, or I and nobody else, I think, has actually found them. And it is shocking that so long after the Sexual Offences Act, that somebody should feel the need to burn or destroy this. I'm busy teaching by now in the 1980s. I've been employed by Leeds University Adult Education Department, and Shibden isn't far away, so I go and visit and enjoy that. But I'm busy teaching, and one of the things that has an impact on me is Helena Whitbread's book, I Know My Own Heart, came out in 1988. It's based on the early diaries, 1817 to 24. And it had sort of considerable local impact because it included the coded sections transcribed and evidence of a local lesbian, which nobody really knew before. Here is Anne Lister proclaiming and celebrating freedoms for women, little dreamt of since. And I introduced photocopies of some of these pages into my Halifax classroom, adult education teaching, because I was teaching a new opportunities for women course in Halifax. And my students, all to a woman, exclaimed, well, we'd no idea that sort of thing went on around here. No one told us. Well, of course, by then, not only they, but I am fascinated. So I go into the archives in Halifax Library and I gradually add pages from the original diary to my teaching and bring them into the classroom. And as we know, we've seen Helena Whitbread's edition is the early Anne Lister. It's very much a romantic Anne Lister with her emotional sexual relationship with Mariana Lawton, who's married to an older man. My curiosity is now razor sharp, and I'm living quite near Shibden. Rachel's very helpfully put that red dot down there where we were living then, and were I to walk up the road or parallel to the canal and up to Halifax and take a sharp right and climb up over that steep hill, I'd get to Shibden. So Anne Lister is indeed sitting on my very doorstep, and I'm a feminist historian and it's too good to miss. So I'm back into the archives in Halifax Library to check the Guardian. They say it's 2 million words. Is it? I mean, the Guardian was notorious, maybe it still is, for its misprints. You know, we used to call it the Growniad because it was even misprinting its own title. So was it really 2 million words or just a few thousand? The diaries are very fragile, of course. So I'm having to go on microfilm. Do you remember microfilm? Endless. And I'm calculating words per line, lines per page, pages per volume, and so on. And I find with all my little calculations on my pocket calculator, it is 4 million words, twice as long as The Guardian had said. I retreat from Halifax Library in the archives, ashen-faced, and I take a few days to recover. I need a research strategy, but what? Well, Helena had worked on the early Anne Lister diaries, as we know, and she'd focused first on the coded sections and only then and later gone to the almost impossible Anne Lister handwriting for the broader picture. And I wondered, is this really necessarily the best way for me to understand and read Anne Lister? I studied some of the earlier editors like John Lister, and I decided the best way for me to understand and write on Anne Lister was to read her diaries as she wrote them, as she slipped effortlessly from handwriting to code, code to handwriting, hour by hour, even mid-sentence. And the result of this was Presenting the Past, 1994. I looked analytically at the earlier editors, John Lister, of course, then Muriel Green, Phyllis Ramsden, then after the Sexual Offences Act, Helena Whitbread. And then I decided to drill down into 3 sections of the diaries, 3 samples. The very early diaries from 1806 onwards, which we'd only just discovered. And then 1819, because it coincides with Peterloo, which Anne Lister was interested in. Then 1832, because I was teaching about the 1832 Reform Act. So the 1990s for me, particularly at the weekends, were long hours of reading the diaries and transcribing. And the result was Female Fortune, which came out in 1998. And it presents Anne Lister for 1883 to 36, so 2.5 years, and includes, for example, the scene we've looked at in the diary original pages, Easter, the 30th of March, 1834, Goodham Gate in Church, and the Union. Again, as a few lines of my work on Anne Lister, which has been of endless fascination and much requoted. And then I went back to 1832, which I only skimmed in Female Fortune, and Nature's Domain in 2003 was the result, which has just had a new edition. This Nature's Domain tells the story of Anne Lister's return to Shibden, betrayed, as we know, by yet another woman's marriage plans. Via Cameron, she retreats from Hastings back to Shibden, reacquaintance with Anne Walker and the Moss Hut seduction. So let's return to our main theme, reading the Anne Lister diaries through the lens of LGBTQ history and the historical context. And here we're moving on. Anyone remember the Local Government Act, Section 28? Probably if you were an adult, then you will. It was promoted in the UK by the Conservative Margaret Thatcher government, 1988 Local Government Act, prohibiting local authorities like Calderdale, which is what Halifax Borough had now become, from promoting homosexuality. There were protests. I can remember them quite vividly. And I just have read about this one on the web more recently. May 1988, lesbian activists storm the BBC News studio. Sue Lawley, if you remember her, is midway through reading the 6 o'clock news, and into the news studio storms women wearing T-shirts saying, "Stop the claws." They handcuff themselves to the news desk, and the BBC has to think very quickly and decide not to press charges because they realise what might happen. So the women go off to Parliament to join other protesters there. And the bill becomes the Act. And from 2003, it lasted for 15 years, 15 years. It's mainly, of course, aimed at schools. It's mainly aimed at teachers, what teachers could or could not teach in the classroom to their pupils. But it also, and this is important to our story, touched other local authority services like museums, like Shibden. And people, friends, neighbours, anybody, often ask me, why hasn't Calderdale Local Authority said more about Anne Lister on their very good display boards at Shibden about Anne Lister being a lesbian? And now you know. it was silenced. And Calderdale is a small local authority. It's only 2 constituencies. It couldn't take on the cost of a major lawsuit with the government. And so once again, there is a culture of silencing, this time with legal underpinning. And it's the first time that lesbians are included in the law. But the good news is, there has to be a bit of good news, even the Local Government Act couldn't censor book publishers. Virago kept Helena Whitbread's book in print, Pennine Pens kept Nature's Domain and Presenting the Past in print, and Rivers Aurum kept Female Fortunes in print. Thank you, publishers. And from 2003, when the Act was abolished, a more tolerant, open era was ushered in, with new approaches, amongst other things, to lesbian history. And so we move on, jumping rather quickly to 2010, a BBC Two drama, one-off drama with Maxine Peake, mainly again about focusing particularly on the early life of Anne Lister. And then 2011, international, global recognition for Anne Lister's diaries at last. The diaries are inscribed in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register for the UK. Global recognition indeed, and the only 2 other UK diarists to be so included as Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn. So wow, thanks, well done, Anne Lister. Yet still no major drama series about the wonderful and complex Anne Lister. And of course, the writer who would bring the full Anne Lister to our screens is, of course, scriptwriter Sally Wainwright. I'd met her in 2001. A mutual friend had given her a copy of Female Fortune, and this was the book that inspired Sally to write, or want to write, about Anne Lister. But despite our hard work and enthusiasm back then, it took 14 years before it was the right time when Sally could pitch her ideas successfully to the BBC, because by then she was an award-winning scriptwriter. And then from the mid 2016 onwards, for a few hectic months, we worked together, I working as the historical advisor. And then I moved on back to Votes for Women for a while, and other advisors took over. And she's a genius scriptwriter, yes. So let's jump forward to last summer. Sally is, having worked with the production company Lookout Point, which was filming at Shibden for Gentleman Jack, and jump forward to last summer, a lot of publicity. And my niece, who works in London and gets off the tube at Oxford Circus, took a photograph of this and sent it to me very excitedly. And here is Ciarán Jones, very, very large and very dramatic, publicising Gentleman Jack at the Oxford Circus tube station. I mean, I'd done things with the BBC before, mainly radio, a bit of television, but never with HBO before. And I'd never seen so much publicity. And it meant that everybody who wanted to watched Gentleman Jack, and we can go to some of the repercussions of that in the Q&A. So I want to leave you in October 2020 with 3 questions, if I may. The first one is, who owns Anne Lister? Let's just consider. Lister descendants, I defy you to find any. The Lister family was dynastically fragile, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. The owners of Shibden Hall, museum service, certainly have a good claim. The custodians of the diaries, West Yorkshire Archives Service, certainly play an invaluable role. The local community, the people of Halifax and more broadly Calderdale, feel very proud of Anne Lister. Editors of the diary, people like Helena Whitbread and myself, and biographers, a good claim. Certainly the LGBTQ community has responded with enormous enthusiasm, as you know, to Gentleman Jack and thus to Anne Lister. And finally, and most recently, filmmakers, program producers, and even tour organisers and badge designers, etc., etc. So a great amount of enthusiasm, particularly, I might suggest, in the local community and in the gay community, in both. Second question, was it easier to live a lesbian life if you were a defiant, brave member of the landed gentry, female member of the landed gentry in the 1830s than, say, a century later. And we look at the silencing right up to 2003, just 17 years ago. So maybe for the lesbian community, bearing in mind those 15 years to 2003, it wasn't all smooth progress. So maybe we can think about that. And now our final question. How do you write about a woman who's already written 4 to 5 million words, lived a lesbian life and recording it in candid detail, written about by a generation of editors and authors. And we've been reading Anne Lister through the lens of local history. We've looked at maps and images of Shibden and the Halifax area. And I think we also want to note gender, because it was such an important factor for Anne Lister generation. She couldn't vote because of her gender, not because of her sexuality. She couldn't vote because of her gender. She couldn't go to university. No woman could, because of her gender, not because of her sexuality. And we'd also want to look at social class, because we've noted, have we not, that she is now a member of the landed gentry, albeit minor, plus of course LGBTQ. So I hope I've been looking at the shifting historical context over 150 years. And I want to emphasize sexuality, gender, social class. All these factors have been really absolutely crucial to help us understand this complex and wonderful woman, Anne Lister. So thank you, Portico Library. Thank you, Aoife, and thank you, Rachel, behind the scenes, for making this possible. And I think we're going to hand over to Aoife now, as one or two people might have some questions. Thank you.
We do indeed have a couple of questions. Thank you very, very much, Jill. That was fantastic. So I'll start straight off with one of the questions we have here, which asks, do you feel as though there are still sides to Anne Lister we are yet to see in the public eye, i.e. in TV, etc.?
Well, the TV, and if we just focus on Gentleman Jack and Sally Wainwright, I mean, what's amazing is that Sally Wainwright and the BBC One and HBO have gone with such intensity and detail into the Anne Lister Diaries. So they start when Nature's Domain starts, which is, in early 1832, and then they go on till halfway through Female Fortune in 1834. So they've really only covered 2 years. Yes, that's right, pretty much 2 years in 8 one-hour episodes. And Sally has worked, helped by other people, Sally has worked so hard on getting to know the diaries. And as I've mentioned, she was inspired by Female Fortune, but she's gone into further detail with her research. So yes, Anne Lister develops on and becomes a more sophisticated woman. It's going to be interesting what sort of aspect of Anne Lister we see in series 2, which I've mentioned. Shibden's just closed. It is literally closed a few days ago to prepare for the filming of series 2. And it'd be interesting to see what sort of aspects Sally Wainwright brings out, whether it is a slightly more sophisticated, more mature Anne Lister. I understand that she's going to be looking at the 1835 election, which, like in the 1837 election, which we talked about, both Anne Lister and Anne Walker, both resident at Shibden Hall, doorstep their tenants. So there'll be much more politics in it. And I'm not going to do any spoilers, because on Twitter, people have got quite annoyed about spoilers, apparently. So I'm not guilty of any spoilers. But just let me say, there were repercussions. There were repercussions in 1835 after that election. And there were repercussions with Anne Lister's, helped by Anne Walker's money from the developing her coal mines. But watch out for series 2, which maybe we'll be able to watch maybe this time next year. Who can say?
I expect we're all looking forward to it. The next question is there evidence that Anne was a scientist? Or where is the evidence that she was?
All over. Why should she not be interested in science? Why should she not read science books? I mean, okay, women couldn't go to university, and they couldn't, as Charles Darwin could, therefore join the learned societies where these papers were discussed, science papers, etc., etc. But that didn't stop her from reading about geology, for example. I think at the Manor School, her boarding school in York, where she met Eliza Raine, there was quite a bit of science, so certainly geography. There was something called globes, not geography, globes. But you can see that she, it must have whetted her appetite for travel. So in the very early 30s, Charles Darwin, and he's still quite young, is curious about how the world began. Was it really through, as Genesis says, or is it more through what we come to know about evolution? And he sets sail on the Beagle, and he's reading the same geology journals, up to date as Anne Lister was, and there their paths part, because Anne Lister couldn't jump on the Beagle and go off, and she couldn't join the learned societies, but Charles Darwin couldn't keep in touch with the latest journals about geology while he was on the Beagle. That wasn't possible. But they were there just like that. And I think that's one of the most impressive things about Anne Lister. And there was nothing, in terms of science, whether it's maths. I mean, her maths was just extraordinary. The later diaries are full of accounts about profit and loss with her coal mines, or how much money is in the bank, and whether she's going to write a check for £100 or £1,000. And her mental arithmetic was just phenomenal. So scientist, yes, but a whole lot else as well.
Great. Okay, this one says, this is about the rights of poor people. It's something we've sort of touched on a little bit already. Is it thought that Anne Lister wasn't too much concerned in regards to the poor law or rights for poor people? Should we see this as a bad thing, that whilst the lady was an entrepreneur, she was the typical landowner, unconcerned with people's rights? Is she a hero or a villain?
Well, luckily, I think we don't have to have just those two rather stark options, heroine or villain. We can say, what is the evidence? Shall we come to a balanced view about Anne Lister? She was fairly typical of her social class of landowners. She cared about people in her local area who she'd known all her life, who fell sick and fell on hard times, and she might go round and offer them some support. If any of her servants likewise fell on hard times, she'd want to support. But poor people generally, she had not much interest in. When she was walking down to Halifax, she almost didn't quite see poor people, of whom there must have been a great number, and they don't really figure in her diary. She walks from Shibden down the steep Old Bank, down into Halifax, past the Minster, up to the Peace Hall, bearing right to Northgate House, which she'd also inherited, a lovely Georgian house in Halifax, which she was turning into a hotel with a casino. A rather traditional meaning of the word casino, a public room where drink could be had rather than much gaming. And she must have walked past, maybe a beggar, maybe somebody who had never recovered from the cholera epidemic. She must have walked past, she must have known of, but she didn't. Her eyes were fixed above it. She just was a woman with a bit of a mission. So certainly in terms of her voting and her politics, we can see her very much on the right of what was emerging as the Conservative Party. She wasn't a Peelite, Robert Peel Conservative. She was more of a Duke of Wellington Conservative. And within the Church of England, she wanted to conserve the rights of the Church of England as the established church, the rights to the vicar, who she was quite friendly with, to collect all his tithes, which amounted to quite a small fortune, rather than the side of the Church of England that was more evangelical, that wanted reforms. So she was a traditionalist, but I've tried as far as possible to balance, to sift the evidence and to come to a balanced view of her, because I think she deserves that, rather than either a heroine who was impeccable or a villain who was just bad, bad, bad.
So why do you think she wrote so much in her diary? Do you think she found her diary to be the only place where she could be completely free and be herself?
she, as I suggested, she wrote more and more as she became more and more serious about herself and took herself really seriously as a member of the local society, national society. At times of trouble, and there were times of trouble in Anne Lister's life, and I'm just going to focus on the 1830s because that's what I know best. There were difficult times with Anne Walker, two women living together, kind of with this lesbian marriage ceremony which Anne Lister had constructed at Goodram Gate. There were some difficulties. It wasn't all smiles and amicable. There were rows, and sometimes Anne Walker would end up in tears, or Anne Lister would refer to Anne Walker's temper. I think it's more sort of tears and weeping. And she would find solace in her writing her journal. There's quite a few references of, oh, I find writing my journal really, really helps. And we can just really identify with that. You know, she was a woman out there in the world without a script. There was nobody telling her really, apart from a few friends who were far away and with whom there might be issues, Isabella Norcliffe, the other side of York, etc., etc., who she could really confide in. And with the death of her aunt, her beloved Aunt Anne, in 1836, autumn 1836, you know, it was very much the journal. I mean, she did, of course, have confiding conversations with Anne Walker when they were getting on very well, which was for whole long periods of time. But when that went a bit wrong, or there were money problems, she would confide in her journal. And we all know what that kind of writing it down makes it feel better. And it certainly did for Anne Lister. And we are the beneficiaries of that.
Okay, the next question asks, do you think it's appropriate to use the word lesbian about Anne Lister when it wasn't used at the time?
Well, it's a good question. It's difficult. It's a difficult one, and I haven't actually been asked that question before. The word lesbian didn't really come into play in sort of public usage till much later in the century. I've used that word, and I think virtually everybody else writing about Anne Lister has used that word because it is our word and we know what it means. And the meaning of a word is its usage, and that's what we use, so that's what we mean, so that's how we write it. I think in what I've written, I've just said, probably in an end note, you know, the word lesbian wasn't in public usage yet. And one of this isn't actually an answer to the question, but it's interesting. One of the things that impeded her critics, and Anne Lister had critics all around, William Priestley nearby, near the Cronest estate in Lightcliffe, the Rawson family, the Rawson brothers in Halifax, and others. They didn't have a polite language. There was no polite language in which they could say what their suspicions, their deep suspicions about Anne Lister's motives in persuading Anne Walker, the wealthy heiress Anne Walker, to come and live at Shibden. They had no language in which to politely express their suspicions of Anne Walker. And even Captain Sutherland, when up in Scotland, way up above Inverness, married to Anne Walker's sister Elizabeth, now Elizabeth Sutherland, could only refer obliquely to, I can't remember his words, malign motives of certain parties when he was writing to the lawyer in Halifax, and that impeded what they could do. And what you'll find in reading Female Fortune is they took other means. There were other means, and they were very inventive and really quite melodramatic on one or two occasions.
Love it. Okay, the last one is a rhetorical question, and it asks, does Jill know what a heroine she, Jill, is to so many of us?
Well, how kind of you, and I don't know who you are or where you are, but thank you very much. That's really very kind of you to say. Somebody did say to me, and I think it might have been an American, said to me, it rather took my breath away when she said this. She said, "You've taken 30 years, Jill, to become an overnight rock star." And I just love that. So thank you very much. Thank you, that last questioner. Thank you, Aoife. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, the Portico.
Thank you, Jill. Right, I will pass over to Rachel for anyone who'd like to know about ordering a book Rachel will explain how it works.
Great, thank you very much, Aoife. And of course, Jill, thank you. I never ever tire of hearing your wonderful presentation, always a slightly different slant, and some fantastic questions. So we've heard all about the books, the book that inspired Gentleman Jack, Female Fortune, Nature's Domain, where Gentleman Jack started, and of course presenting the past. So I think the most important thing, if you just note the email address in the bottom paragraph, herdenofhebden@gmail.com. That is my email address. If you just write to me, tell me which of the books you are interested in, I will go to the post office, find out the costs, and I'll email you back, and then we'll organise Jill signing the books and me posting them out to you. So if you just email me at herdenofhebden@gmail.com, the email address there, and we will sort that out for you, and you can get your books fairly quickly. So thanks very much, Aoife.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rachel. And it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Jill again. And thank you to everyone who chose to spend your evening with us. Thank you so much for coming and for all your fantastic questions. And hope to see you again soon. All right. Enjoy your evening.
Bye. Bye.